I do not know. I see no reason to give a specific example under a particular name. However, for the purpose of clarification, I say, let us assume that in the course of negotiations we discussed what may be called a station along the way to peace, as required by the UN resolutions, and at this particular stage an idea is put forward calling on the parties to take a certain measure, which may come within the framework of confidence-building measures, and may push the peace process forward. We may agree to such a measure if we are all convinced that it is quite useful. As to what this measure could be, this would be inspired by the negotiations, the prevailing spirit therein and their direction, whether it is forward towards peace or backwards. If they view us, as you have said, how do we see them? We have statements by many Israeli leaders, speeches and other things that corroborate this. This shows very clearly that their aim is expansion, land acquisition, the displacement of other millions to be added to the Palestinian, Syrian, and Lebanese displaced people. When this is the case, we are entitled to say about them far more than they say about us. Yet, let us put this aside and go back to the question of destruction. We say that we want to implement the UN resolutions and to adhere to them. Anybody who reads these resolutions will find nothing in them referring to the destruction of others, be they Arabs or Israelis. This in itself refers to the attitude of Syria and of the Arabs to the peace process. Furthermore, how could we call for peace and be understood as seeking destruction? How can we adhere to peace and call for it for many years while it claimed at the same time that we seek destruction? I refer you to my speech during the October War when fighting was at its height between us and the Israelis. I addressed our people and the world. I remember that I said, we want death to nobody. We want destruction to nobody. We are only defending ourselves against death and destruction. You can revise a large number of statements I gave to many different mass media in the East and West and in the Arab mass media. In those statements, I have stressed that our people and the Arab nations want peace, and to achieve peace, and that they adhere to the resolutions of international legitimacy. After all this, is it right to say that we are the hardliners, that we seek destruction while the others are the doves of peace? Would they were, then we would have achieved peace. And now I tell you, we do not seek destruction. We rather want comprehensive and just peace. Nobody inside or outside our region, or in Europe, America, East Europe, and other areas of the world has any interest in not achieving a comprehensive peace in this region. Because any separate peace or separate and partial peace process will not realize peace, security, or the stability in this region. Any one party that remains in a state of war with Israel will reverse this region once more to comprehensive and complex conditions and consequently to comprehensive wars in the future. Therefore, multilateral wars and conflicts require comprehensive peace. I am here stressing what I consider as principled and beneficial to all the parties. I can give evidence to this from the realities of all the regions. Such evidence is well known to all. I assure you that if we all were serious in search of peace, then we would be able to overcome all obstacles which may block the road to peace. At the same time, I stress that we, the Arabs, are serious in search of peace. I am not discussing the technique of work. I am rather arguing from the standpoint of the comprehensive nature of the settlement. This does not mean that a step here must be accompanied by a step there. I do not mean that the negotiations in various committees should be exactly parallel. Nobody would adhere to this because it is not practical. But I am discussing the final settlement, which must be a comprehensive one. On the other hand, if one committee is advancing rapidly and another is moving slowly, this is only the nature of things, and it is inevitable.
Would you look optimistically for a peace treaty at the end of this? to be signed by all of the parties?
Of course, we have to reach a peace agreement if we want peace. Clearly, it is my view that it is the interest of all to reach such agreement.
Was this only another example of the famous shrewdness of President Hafiz Asad?
On matters concerning the United States, an American official should be asked. As far as we are concerned, certain events have taken place, of which our opinions were not dissimilar without prior agreement. Perhaps this has led to improvement of relations between the two countries. And perhaps American officials noticed, and I say perhaps because I do not want to speak or discuss their motives on their behalf, that what has been said about Syria was not true, and much of what has been said in America and in other countries was not true. Anyone who tried to follow up and to know realistically and objectively the conditions in this region and Syria's attitude towards several issues, which arose during several past years, would conclude that very much of the talk about Syria was false. That is why I say perhaps some of the American officials realized that the impressions they have got or convictions that they had formed were based on false talk or at least inaccurate talk. Let me give you some examples of what used to be said about Syria. While we were continually emphasizing the importance of peace and the work for peace, some people used to say and are still saying that Syria rejects peace. It was said that Syria practices terrorism and takes part in acts against American citizens at a time when we were helping to save many Americans from difficulties and from acts that were very grave. These are only two examples of what used to be said about Syria inside and outside the U.S. I believe that at least some of those who spread rumors about Syria have learnt the truth about the real position of Syria.
Compared to previous administrations?
I made the acquaintance of President Bush when we met in Geneva, and made the acquaintance of Secretary Baker in our several meetings during his trips to the region. I have respect for both men. At the same time, I want to say that during a certain period in the 1970s, there were some developments in the relations between Syria and the U.S., but this regressed after the Camp David Accords. The important thing is not who is better than the other. It's really strange that this question was put to me only recently in a previous interview with the American television network. And I wonder what is behind this question. At any rate, I can say that we in Syria and Iraq belong to the same nation. We sympathize with the people of Iraq to a maximum degree, and also with the other Arab people. We share their suffering. At a certain time, we in Syria and Saddam Hussein and a group of Iraqi leaders were in the same party, which is the Bаас party. But we differed long ago and became two separate, totally different parties since 1966. Throughout the rule of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there has never been any agreement or normal relations between the two countries, except for a few months, not exceeding 6 months. Otherwise, our differences have been total and continuous. This in itself offers the same answer to your question, specifically if you want to read the implications of this situation. In fact, the issue may be larger since we have differences for such a long time throughout the rule of Saddam Hussein. There are many differences between us in personalities and acts and principles and other things. Our differences were not only during his rule. As I have said, we split into two separate parties 25 years ago. This means that the points of meeting between us, if they exist, are very scarce.
What do you think? You live close to Iraq. Do you think the outcome of Desert Storm was about right? Does Saddam Hussein still pose a threat to Middle East security?
What Syria was concerned about was to end the occupation of Kuwait by the forces of the Iraqi regime. Syria had no other concern beyond that. If the question means that the forces of Desert Storm should have entered Iraq, changed the regime, and made or set up a new regime, we neither believe in this nor approve of it. The issue concerns a general principle, namely that no state has the right to intervene in the internal affairs of another, in the sense of sending its forces inside, removing the ruling regime and setting up another to replace it. For us, this is a principle. As for me, I think we ought to suppose that it applies to all the peoples of the world. This opinion is not changed by the difference that has been and is still standing between us and Saddam Hussein and the ruling regime in Iraq. In our opinion, the change of the regime or keeping it in Iraq or in any country is the concern of the respective people themselves. General developments on the whole have contributed to the improvement of the situation. I mean, they have helped to create a better climate, advantageous to the hostage and the abducted. In the past, too, a number of hostages of various nationalities were released. Syria most certainly has had a hand in helping those released. This is still the case today. Syria cooperates with all those able to help, be they states or groups in the region, in order to help the abducted. Perhaps the improvement of the situation in Lebanon was one of the major factors that made things better, in addition to Syria's efforts in collaborating with others, and the possibility that such joint efforts have benefited from the climate to which I have just referred. I would like also to point out to the cooperation of Iran and the important role it plays in helping the hostages. In fact, I have no information on the kidnappers, in the sense that they are frightened or not. I have read something about that in some newspapers. Of course, we do not know the kidnappers in person. Anyway, I do not think that fear, if they are really frightened, is a factor that helped in freeing those who were released recently. As I said, I believe that it is the efforts made and the general climate in Lebanon and in the region that help. I am optimistic in my expectation of the possible release of the hostages who suffer from conditions so difficult from the human point of view. I am optimistic that they will be released in the near future. I repeat that fear was not the factor which helped in the recent releases of hostages. Witness the fact that a big number of them were released before the period in which there was talk about the fear of the abductors. I have no information that would enable me to say yes or no just now.
Just one final question, Mr. President. When people around the world look at the opening of this Madrid peace conference, and they see angry words, and they hear recriminations, should they give up and feel that there's still no chance for peace in the Middle East?
As far as I know, there are no angry words so far on the Arab side. Statements by various Arab officials are rational and logical. The angry words you refer to can be heard from some Israeli officials. You hear their angry words in the United States, and we hear them here in Syria and in the other Arab countries. If you mean what may be said at the opening of the conference, I think the Arab position will remain the same, and there will be no angry words on the part of the Arabs. However, it is only natural that the Arabs should express what they believe is right and just, and to abide by the UN resolutions, to insist on the commencement of the peace process, and to follow it up until peace is achieved through sense, logic, tranquility, and patience, and not through anger. We are going to the conference. We are serious, and we adhere to peace and hope that the others will be the same.